4. USS Johnston. The USS Johnston, led by Commander Ernest Evans, was sunk during the Battle of Samar, which was fought off the coast of Samar Island in the Philippine Sea in October of 1944. The vessel was built during World War II for the United States Navy, named after Lieutenant John V. Johnston, an officer who served in the American Civil War in September of 1861. The Battle of Samar was the centermost action of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was one of the biggest naval battles ever fought in history. This was the only major action in which the Americans were wildly unprepared during the larger battle. However, in the end, the US prevailed over the Imperial Japanese Navy's massive armada, in what has now been considered one of the greatest last stands ever recorded. The USS Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, and she was commissioned by the US Navy on October 27, 1943. The vessel was involved in 3 campaigns against the Japanese during its time of service. One off the coast of Gilbert and Marshall Islands, another in the seas surrounding the Solomon Islands, and the last of which took place in the waters of Mariana and Palau Islands. Then, in 1944, almost a year after being commissioned, Johnston would go on to fight its very last battle, the Battle of Samar. Johnston had just been assigned to the US Navy's 7th Fleet, which at the time was preparing to invade the Philippines. Their main goal was to expel and defeat the Imperial Japanese forces that were occupying the island country. Johnston, along with a small army made up of destroyers and escort carriers, was led by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. This subunit of the 7th Fleet's escort carrier group was called the TU-77.4.3, or better known as Taffy 3. On October 17th, Taffy 3 sailed into the Leyte Gulf, not knowing what to expect from their enemies. The next day, 3 Japanese fleets were dispatched and ordered to destroy and cut off any and all American ground forces they encountered. Under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the largest of these fleets took a path that would lead directly to the ships of Taffy 3 on October 25th. Kurita's fleet was made up of 8 cruisers, 4 battleships, and 11 destroyers, all of which were heavily bombarded by American aircraft and submarines over the previous 2 days. Johnston was situated roughly 34,000 yards southeast from the Japanese, but was only informed of its close proximity just minutes before they were attacked. This marked the beginning of the Battle of Samar. Not long after fighting began, Commander Evans ordered Johnston to turn northeast so they could charge the Japanese, carry out a torpedo attack, then lay a cover of smoke in order to make an escape. The enemy cruiser Kumano fired at it as it sailed within 18,000 yards of the ship. However, Johnston fought back and hit Kumano at least 40 times with their main battery shells, subsequently setting the cruiser's superstructure on fire. Then, after sailing within 10,000 yards of their target, Johnston unloaded all 10 of their torpedoes on board at Kumano. At least one of the explosives was a direct hit, and the bow of the Japanese cruiser was blown off entirely, forcing it to retire from battle. But Johnston wasn't done with the ship yet, and she charged and engaged Kumano head-on, which only made her a target for the Japanese. As a result, 2 battleships and 2 cruisers from the Imperial Navy turned their sights on Johnston. Consequently, the American destroyer sustained 3 6-inch and 3 14-inch shell hits. This caused major damage to the ship's bridge and engineering spaces, and left numerous casualties for the crew on board. Johnston's steering engine, gyro compass, and aft 5-inch guns were all lost during the skirmish, reducing the vessel's speed to 17 knots, 20 miles per hour or 31 kilometers per hour. Over the next 10 minutes, the destroyer was hidden in a cloud of smoke accompanied by a sudden rainstorm, which allowed the crew to restore power to 2 of the ship's aft main guns. Johnston then attempted to rejoin the rest of her subunit, but stopped when she encountered USS Heermann, USS Hull, and USS Samuel B. Roberts, all on their way to carry out their own torpedo attacks against the enemy. And so, Commander Evans changed directions and instead followed the American ships to support them. During the chaos and exchanged fire, Johnston and Heermann became enveloped in a thick cloud of smoke, almost causing them to collide into each other. However, through evasive maneuvers, they avoided this fate. Not long after, Johnston engaged the entire Japanese squadron, opening fire on their cruiser Yahagi. She managed to land 12 blows on the enemy, but was then struck several times by 5-inch shells in retaliation. Yahagi was also heavily bombarded by US aircraft from above, at which point the vessel disengaged and turned to starboard. Johnston then set her sights on several Japanese destroyers, all of whom tried to return fire but didn't land a single hit. Unfortunately, this caused the entire squadron as well as 2 other Imperial cruisers to focus solely on Johnston. And as a result, the destroyer's main mast, last engine, guns, and bridge were all deemed unusable. This is when Evans ordered the ship's crew to abandon the vessel. Unfortunately, Evans went down with Johnston and was among the 186 officers and men that perished. However, the rest of the 141 men that were on board the ship were rescued by American vessels after being stuck in the water for 50 hours. While the USS Johnston didn't survive the Battle of Samar, it played a key part in securing the American victory over the Japanese forces. The ship, even though it sank, received 6 battle stars as well as a Presidential Unit citation for its extraordinary heroism. And after his death, Commander Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor for his incredible acts of courage. 3. USS Arizona. The USS Arizona's last stand against the Japanese forces only lasted a few minutes. On December 7, 1941, the day of the atrocious attack on Pearl Harbor, the vessel was in port with the rest of the Pacific Fleet. However, just before 8 a.m. that morning, US history would be changed forever. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers showed up in the waters of Hawaii and subsequently attacked the American fleet. The USS Arizona had only been informed of their impending arrival at 7:55 a.m. when the ship's air raid alarm suddenly went off. The vessel's crew immediately rushed to their battle stations, but they couldn't have known what was coming. Just minutes later, 10 Nakajima B-5N2 torpedo bombers took to the skies from aircraft carriers Hiryu and Kaga with their sights set on the Arizona. Each of the bombers was equipped with 41cm armor-piercing shells, which had been modified into 1,757-pound bombs. As they flew overhead at an estimated altitude of about 9,800 feet, the Japanese aircraft dropped several of these powerful bombs on the Arizona. Then, just a short time later, bombers from the Hiryu released more explosives aimed at the American ship's bow area. In total, the Japanese forces landed 4 direct hits on their target and had 3 near misses, which caused observers of the attack to believe that the Arizona had been struck by a torpedo. But this wasn't the case, and in reality, things were a lot worse than they seemed. The first of the bombs that landed on the ship ricocheted off of one of the vessel's turrets, forcing it to penetrate the deck of the battleship, detonating in the captain's pantry. This event caused a small fire to spark on board, but this was the least of their problems. One of the other explosives hit the ship near its port edge close to the main mast, likely going off in the area where the anti-torpedo bulkhead was located. The next bomb struck the Arizona on the vessel's rear port, next to the 5-inch AA gun on board. Then, at approximately 8:06 a.m., the final bomb landed in the vicinity of Turret 2, most likely penetrating the ship's armored deck near where the magazines were stored in the Arizona's forward section. This last blow sealed the vessel's fate, as the magazines detonated in a cataclysmic explosion just 7 seconds after the final bomb hit the surface of the ship's deck. The Arizona was basically reduced to rubble following the aerial assault, and it's said that the fire from the explosion burned for a full 2 days as Ford Island was showered with debris and ash. In the end, over 1,100 crewmen were killed, making up almost half of the total lives lost during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. What is your favorite battleship from naval history? Let us know in the comments, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 2. Italian battleship Roma. The Italian battleship known as Roma was considered to be a very capable vessel. However, it only made one brief appearance and was used as a kind of sacrificial lamb for the Marina Militare, the Italian Navy. She was ultimately taken down by the German Luftwaffe in September of 1943 in the Strait of Bonifacio, which divides the Western Mediterranean Sea from the Tyrrhenian Sea. At this point during World War II, things were not going great for Italy, and they decided that they no longer wanted to be involved. Mussolini was already deposed, and just 2 months prior, he was arrested. Pietro Badoglio, the new prime minister, secretly began negotiations with Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the leader of the Allied forces, even though he still openly professed his allegiance to Adolf Hitler. In early September of that year, an agreement was made between Eisenhower and Badoglio, which called for the Italian fleet to be handed over to the Allies at Malta. But many of the naval officers were not informed of this brief armistice and instead prepared for battle when they were ordered to begin the invasion of Salerno on the 8th of that month. For the Roma, this action marked her first mission since joining the Italian fleet earlier that year. While tied up in La Spezia before heading to Salerno, Roma served as a floating anti-aircraft battery amidst air raids and had already been severely damaged after being hit by multiple bombs from American B-17s. But after repairs were made in Genoa, the battleship prepared for war. Once they made it to the open seas, they headed for the Strait of Bonifacio, but not long after, they received word that one of their other vessels had been captured by the Germans. The commander of the fleet, Admiral Carlo Bergamini, then ordered the ships to turn around and sail towards Malta. While they were within sight of the island of Asinara, Roma's crew spotted several aircraft trailing them. They were initially unable to identify who the planes belonged to since they were flying at such a high altitude. This ultimately would lead to their downfall as they didn't take defensive positions fast enough. The aircraft belonged to the German Luftwaffe, and they proceeded to drop bombs on the Italian battleship, but they would miss their target. The crew was taken by surprise, and when the explosives landed in the water, they knew they were in trouble. The Luftwaffe closed in on the fleet just an hour later, and Bergamini ordered the fleet to begin evasive maneuvers, and they all opened fire on the Germans. One of the aircrafts hit Roma with a bomb, and it crashed through several decks of the ship before it exploded beneath the keel. Consequently, the two inboard propellers were disabled, and the engine room flooded with water. Several fires sparked on the vessel, and this forced the Roma to fall out of the battle group. The warship was then hit by a second bomb, which detonated in the engine room, ultimately destroying the ship. Whoever wasn't initially killed by the blasts were left badly burned from the fires that had broken out on board. The battleship broke into two pieces and subsequently sank into the water. 1. The Last Battle of Bismarck. Between the 26th and 27th of May 1941, the German battleship Bismarck fought for its life against the air elements and naval forces of the British Royal Navy. The battle took place in the Atlantic Ocean, about 300 miles west of Brest, France. The Bismarck's fuel tanks were already badly damaged, and the boiler room as well as several machinery compartments were flooded during another skirmish it was involved in just days before on May 24th. Before the vessel's final battle, the captain planned to sail to the port of Brest so the ship could be repaired, but they never made it to their intended destination. The Bismarck was being followed by the HMS Prince of Wales, the HMS Norfolk, and the HMS Suffolk, but the German battleship was able to evade its pursuers by making a sharp turn, heading further into the Atlantic. On May 25th, the British forces lost all contact with the Bismarck, seemingly unaware that their target had changed directions and was now headed east-southeast while they were searching northeast. However, later that day, a message from German Admiral Gunther Lutjens was intercepted by the British, which allowed them to approximate the position of the Bismarck. At this point, Royal Navy aircraft were sent to search for the German battleship, which was rediscovered during the late morning hours of May 26th by a flying boat called a Catalina. Once the Bismarck was identified, the Force H fleet was dispatched to their location and a series of airstrikes ensued. The British aircraft carrier, known as the Ark Royal, showed up on the scene and deployed several torpedo bombers, which dropped explosives onto the German ship. This attack left the Bismarck's steering gear disabled and caused her rudders to get jammed, which prevented her from escaping. Basically dead in the water, the ship was subject to harassment and shadowing from the British Navy for the entirety of that night. Then, on the morning of May 27th, the HMS Rodney, the HMS King George V, and a small fleet of British cruisers showed up in the water to finish the Bismarck off. After a period of about 100 minutes, the German battleship was done for. She subsequently sank into the frigid waters of the Atlantic, taking most of the crew with her. More than 2,000 people had been on board the Bismarck that day, and only 111 of them were saved. If you were on a sinking ship, Would you jump overboard immediately, hoping to be rescued, or would you try to secure a seat on a lifeboat, even if it meant you could possibly be trapped on the submerging vessel?
Number 9. Human remains? One of the most controversial debates that came with the discovery of the Titanic is whether it's appropriate to explore a sunken ship containing the remains of most of the 1,500 victims. There are other questions as well, including whether or not it's okay to raise certain items and parts of the wreck, and if it's appropriate to explore the sunken vessel in the name of science before it crosses the line into disrespect toward the unfortunate souls who came to rest along with the ship. An ongoing discussion about whether to retrieve the telegraph that sent out the ship's distress signal has brought up the possibility that if a salvage is permitted, it will inevitably disturb human remains. Yet those who have participated in the many dives to the wreck since its discovery in 1985 claim that no human remains were ever found. Some experts have argued that just because no distinguishable bones or skeletons have been spotted doesn't mean that they aren't there. One particular photograph taken in 2004 and published in 2012 sparked claims that the image appeared to contain visual evidence of human remains. Newspaper articles pointed out that the picture showed what looked like a coat and boots in the mud, and that they were placed in a fashion that suggests they marked the final resting place of someone who was wearing them when the ship went down. As the NOAA's Maritime Heritage Director, James Delgado, put it, these are not shoes that fell out neatly from somebody's bag right next to each other. For now, the debate rages on, as some argue that even if things like pairs of shoes mark people's final resting places, the absence of actual human remains makes it impossible to say whether a body was actually in that spot at one point. Number 8. Violin. In the Titanic movie that came out in 1997, the Titanic's band played music to keep passengers calm as the ship began to sink. And it's true. Alongside his fellow musicians, the band's leader, Wallace Hartley, played his violin as the iconic ship took on water and passengers loaded onto lifeboats. The instrument, which was given to Hartley as an engagement gift, was still strapped to him when his body was recovered 2 weeks after the disaster. Its whereabouts remained somewhat of a mystery between then and 2006, when it was rediscovered in an attic of a British home. Testing of saltwater deposits on the artifact revealed that it was indeed the authentic Titanic violin. It also has an engraved silver plate which points to its authenticity as Hartley's instrument. In 2013, it sold for $1.7 million at auction, and in 2020, the piece went on display at the Branson Museum in Missouri, which houses hundreds of Titanic artifacts along with its sister museum in Tennessee. The violin is visibly aged and damaged and has just 2 strings on it, serving as an eerie reminder of how some of the last moments on the ship were spent before it slipped beneath the waves. In addition to the violin, a broken clarinet was found among the wreckage many years later. Number 7. Love letter. On April 10, 1912, 4 days before the Titanic sank, ship steward Richard Geddes wrote a letter to his wife on original RMS Titanic stationery. The letter survived because it was mailed during a stop in Ireland before the sinking. It was found along with the original White Star Line envelope it was placed in, making it an extremely rare and valuable artifact. In the letter, Geddes wrote about how the Titanic nearly collided with a smaller vessel, revealing that it had at least one close call before it struck an iceberg with deadly consequences. He wrote, "My dearest Sal, we got away yesterday after a lot of trouble. As we were passing the New York and Oceanic, the New York broke her ropes and nearly ran into us. The 2 vessels reportedly came within feet of each other." Even more chilling was Geddes' reassurance to his wife that she didn't need to worry about him because the Titanic seemed like a sturdy ship. Geddes was among the 1,500 people who lost their lives on the ill-fated journey. His sign-off on the letter, which reads, "With fondest love and kisses to my dear wife and kiddies," were his last words to his family. The letter made headlines ahead of its planned sale at auction, where experts predicted that it would sell for around £18,000 or $23,279 US. Number 6. Second-class passenger's pocket watch. Sinai Cantor was a 34-year-old Jewish-Russian immigrant who boarded the Titanic as a second-class passenger. He had big dreams for a new life in America. He was joined by his wife, Miriam. Cantor was a fur dealer. He brought a number of his furs on the Titanic with him in hopes that he could sell enough of them to support himself and Miriam as they pursued educations in New York. While they were both already college graduates, they were eager to take the next steps in their careers. Cantor hoped to study medicine, while Miriam wanted to become a dentist. Sadly, the couple never got the opportunity to pursue their goals together. When it became clear that the Titanic was sinking and the lifeboats began to fill up, women and children were given priority. Miriam made it onto a lifeboat, but her husband did not. He died in the sinking. When recovery workers pulled Cantor's body from the frigid North Atlantic waters, they found numerous personal items, including a pocket watch featuring Hebrew numerals. On the reverse side, there's an embossed image of Moses holding the 10 Commandments. In 2018, the heavily damaged and time-worn pocket watch sold at auction for $57,500. It came with documents detailing Miriam's struggle to obtain her late husband's belongings. She eventually succeeded, and they remained in the family until the auction. The pocket watch was purchased by John Mietel, who owns the Mietel Museum in California, and said that he planned to put it on display. Number 5. Diningwear. A lot of the plates, bowls, cups, and cutlery that the Titanic's passengers used have been retrieved from the dark, icy depths of the wreck. In 2003, several dozen ceramic bowls were put on display at a special exhibition called Titanic, the Artifact Exhibit in Los Angeles. The pieces were lined up and arranged in rows in a bed of sediment. This gave them the eerie resemblance of the dinnerware that had ended up on the ocean floor and reminded viewers of where the bowls ended up before they were retrieved as artifacts. Other items, including plates and cups bearing the White Star Line logo, were also salvaged from the Titanic wreck. Much like the rest of the ship's accommodations, the fancier pieces were reserved for diners from the first class, while the simplest items were for third-class passengers. Researchers also retrieved a menu from the last first-class dinner the passengers ate before the ship sank. It consisted of a 10-course meal starting with hors d'oeuvres and oysters, followed by 2 soup choices including cream of barley and consommé Olga, and ending with ice cream, eclairs, and pudding. The courses in between consisted of other fine dining choices, including poached salmon, lamb with mint sauce, filet mignon, Lyonnaise chicken, roast duckling, beef sirloin, foie gras, and numerous other items. If you had a chance to experience the Titanic's last meal for yourself, what would you order? Share your thoughts in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 4. Cherub Statue. If you've seen the Titanic movie, you may have noticed that there's an angel statue perched at the bottom of the grand staircase. It's the same staircase that Rose descends as she's about to meet Jack for a first-class dinner. There really was a bronze cherub statue on the Titanic, which researchers believe was a light fixture from a staircase connecting the sea deck to the promenade deck. It was just one of numerous cherub decorations that adorned the ship. Most were found along the 5-level grand staircase, the one depicted in that famous Titanic scene. Much like in the movie, the staircase sat beneath multiple large glass domes that let natural light in. The breathtaking staircase also featured oak paneling, candelabras, and other elaborate decor that meant to match the opulence of the ship's wealthy first-class passengers. Just 2 years after the wreck was discovered in 1985, the cherub statue was brought to the surface. It was discovered by the RMS Titanic Inc. Underwater Research Program's director, Paul Henry Nargiolet. It has been put on display in various places as part of a traveling collection. Number 3. Wireless telegraph. The Titanic's distress call was sent from a piece of technology that was relatively new at the time, called a Marconi telegraph. It was a wireless device that revolutionized the ability to communicate in places where a cable system wasn't easily accessible, including on ships. Marconi telegraphs were installed in most ships by the time the Titanic set sail, and were typically operated by Marconi Company operators. The machines communicated using Morse code and were capable of transmitting messages over a 300-mile or 483-kilometer distance during the day and up to 900 miles or 1,448 kilometers at night. While the Titanic had some of the best communications equipment available, there was no set standard for conveying distress. And because the technology was advanced for the time, but still had a long way to go, the telegraph operators on the ship missed several ice warnings from other vessels in the hours leading up to the collision with an iceberg. Luckily for the Titanic, the Carpathia's telegraph operator was still on duty when its numerous distress messages went out. The Carpathia immediately began making the 60-mile or 97-kilometer journey to the Titanic's location. It took the volunteer rescue ship about 4 hours to get there. By the time it had arrived, the Titanic had plunged toward its watery grave with at least 1,500 of its passengers and crew members. But thanks to the Marconi Telegraph's ability to transmit the SOS, over 700 people were rescued. In recent years, there's been a heated debate about whether to retrieve the radio equipment from the wreck. The RMS Titanic Inc. company, which has exclusive rights to the salvage of certain artifacts, has campaigned for permission from a court. They want to retrieve the Marconi telegraph that was used to send the distress message, arguing that the wreck is likely to collapse in the coming years. Once this happens, it will be impossible to retrieve the equipment. On the other hand, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, argued that retrieving the telegraph would inevitably involve disturbing the remains of the 1,500 victims who went down with the ship. In 2020, a judge ruled in favor of the team wanting to salvage the radio, but the mission was scrapped in early 2021 due to logistical challenges, financial setbacks, and COVID-19 related concerns. Whether or not the company will revisit the idea before the Titanic collapses remains to be seen. Number 2. Clothing and accessories. Among the most haunting artifacts recovered from the Titanic disaster are passengers' clothing items and accessories. One gem-encrusted bracelet features the name Amy, a shiny gold purse, a hairpin, and a shiny ring were also found among the ship's ruins. During a series of 7 multiple recovery missions to the wreck site between 1997 and 2004, explorers found a black button-down vest that belonged to a third-class passenger from England named William Henry Allen. His body was never recovered, but some of the buttons were still attached to the waistcoat when it was found in the wreckage decades later. The recovery team also recovered plenty of footwear, including a pair of children's shoes and a pair of boots that were found in a position indicating that they were still in the place where the person wearing them died. Near the wreck, explorers found a hat and a pair of ladies' gloves inside a suitcase. Another suitcase held a tattered pajama set. Personal relics like these help to bring the experience of the Titanic's passengers to life, conveying the sheer sorrow and terror of what turned out, for many, to be their final moments. Number 1. The Big Piece. During a dive to the Titanic wreck site in August of 1998, a recovery team raised a 15-ton or 13.6 metric tons piece of the ship's shell plating. After spending nearly a century at the bottom of the North Atlantic, its original yellow and white paint coating was long gone, but the Big Piece, as it came to be called, still had the remarkable effect of taking the viewer back in time. The nearly 27-foot long or 8.2-meter fragment consists of several frames or ribs from the ship's structure. Altogether, the Titanic was made of 300 frames. The Big Piece consisted of 9 of them, which formed the outer wall of 2 different staterooms, part of the first and second class kitchen, and a storage room for glassware. These rooms were located on both the C and D decks of the ship. The part of the vessel that contained the Big Piece was obliterated during the disaster when the ship broke in two, according to the Magnificent Titanic blog. It was one of numerous fragments of shell plating that broke off the Titanic and still bears evidence of the wreck in the form of torn edges and its deformed shape.
3. KV1 Tank. In 1941, the Nazis pushed their way into Russia and headed toward the city of Leningrad, known today as St. Petersburg. They destroyed numerous Soviet air bases along the way. They encircled the city with the goal of cutting its inhabitants off from supplies and food, and essentially starving the Red Army into surrendering. The siege was carried out as part of Hitler's grand plan to conquer Russia, known as Operation Barbarossa. It lasted for nearly 2.5 years. The Red Army took some heavy hits, especially during the first few months. But the Nazis weren't expecting the Soviets to put up much of a fight and were taken slightly off guard by the Red Army's fierce resistance to German occupation. The Russians had some key advantages that helped them stand their ground in their 872-day-long siege. One of these advantages was exceptional tank technology. At the time, Klimon Voroshilov 1 or KV1 Tank functioned as the Red Army's standard heavy tank. It was developed after the Soviet military experienced disappointing results with its previous tank, the T-35, which proved to be slow and mechanically unreliable. The 50-ton KV-1 tank was far superior to any of the Nazis' military vehicles, including the Panzer tanks, which were formidable in their own right. German anti-tank weapons were largely ineffective against the K-1, owing to its heavy armor, which was 3.5 inches thick in some places, and enabled Soviet tank crews to hold up the enemy for days at a time. KV-1 tanks served alongside KV-2 heavy assault tanks. Both vehicles weren't developed at the same time. The KV-2 was equipped with a bigger gun, which made it heavier and therefore slower and far less effective in combat than the KV-1. It was also much more vulnerable to being captured by the Nazis. Only 200 to 250 KV-2s were ever produced. The KV-1 had its own share of disadvantages. As durable as it was against enemy gunfire, the Wehrmacht nevertheless managed to destroy 29 of them with explosive charges and direct fire artillery, and the Soviets lost hundreds of the tanks in battle. It was also designed in a hurry. Writing for Armor magazine in 2002, Stephen Sewell described the KV-1 as a death trap. He further explained that many Red Army commanders were afraid of offending the tank's designer, Joseph Kotin, so they avoided telling him about the true extent of the vehicle's problems. Military officials eventually began to speak up, and Kotin set out to resolve the issues with the help of engineer Nikolai Shashmurin. Their solution was the development of the faster and lighter KV-1S tank. Equipped with thinner armor and a smaller turret, it made up for some of its predecessor's shortcomings, although the changes made it more like a slow medium tank than a speedy heavy tank. All the KV series tanks were expensive to produce, and as the war dragged on, the Soviets designed less expensive tanks that performed better in combat. Production of the KV tanks ultimately fell in favor of the T-34 medium tank, which was just as effective against the Germans but was much lighter and faster than the KV tanks. It became extremely popular throughout the world, making it the most heavily produced tank of World War II and the second most produced tank of all time. At least 39 countries acquired T-34s for their militaries, including Afghanistan, China, Cuba, Namibia, Finland, Vietnam, Yemen, Cyprus, and more. The KV-1S served as the basis for the development of the Joseph Stalin 1 or IS-1 later in the war. At the time, German tank power was improving, and Stalin felt the need to manufacture a new heavy armored vehicle to maintain the Soviet Union's tank superiority over the Nazis. The IS-1 was the first of at least 7 IS series heavy tanks that were developed throughout World War II as breakthrough vehicles. The IS-1 had an upgraded engine that helped to increase its speed along with several other improvements, but it also had several shortcomings. Capable of firing only 2 rounds per minute due to its slow reload rate, it was ineffective as a tank destroyer. But its ammunition was highly explosive, which made the tank ideal for assaulting and blowing up enemy bunkers. Heavy tanks fell out of favor after the war ended, when they were rendered obsolete by the T-34 and other medium tanks, which were far more practical, quicker, and easier to operate and maneuver. But both the KV series and the IS series tanks proved critical to carrying the Soviet Union through the conflict and to the Allied victory. And while they both had considerable flaws, they served their purpose well. 2. T14 Armata, Russia owns the world's largest stockpile of tanks, most of which are aging and obsolete Soviet relics that wound up in storage yards after the Soviet Union fell. In recent years, the country's military has started to undergo some major modernization efforts. And officials flex as often as possible about these new developments to make sure that the US and the rest of the world know about them. One of the focal points of Russia's bragging is the T14 Armata tank. It was designed to replace the aging T95 model, which was cancelled in 2010, and the military claims that it will be the best and most advanced tank in the world once it enters service. Designed over a 5-year period, the prototypes can accommodate a 3-person crew and are each equipped with an unmanned turret. It's armed with a cannon, a gun that's capable of taking down low-flying aircraft, and a secondary armament consisting of a remote control machine gun that's capable of shooting either 300 or 1,000 rounds. There's enough storage room for 1,000 extra rounds of ammunition. The diesel-powered T14 has an alleged maximum speed of 51 miles per hour and an operational range of 311 miles. To protect the crew, the vehicle is outfitted with explosive reactive armor, which is designed to respond to an impact in a way that reduces damage as much as possible. In a modern step up from Russia's past tanks, it has a computerized control system and combat software designed to detect, analyze, and automatically respond to threats. It's also capable of correcting operational errors among crew members. The tank's Active Protection System, APS, consists of an extremely high-frequency radar system for detecting, tracking, and intercepting anti-tank munitions. It reportedly protects the tank on all sides but not from above, leaving the vehicle and its crew members vulnerable to an attack from the air. Some Russian sources claim that the T-14's APS is effective against advanced armor-piercing rounds. The Russian Ministry of Defense backed these claims, but many experts remain skeptical. The deputy director of Uralvagonzavod, the company tasked with building the tank, has also made some claims about the T-14 that are difficult to believe. In 2015, he said that the tank will be coated with radar-absorbing paint and other features that'll make it invisible to radar and infrared detection. To keep sensitive information from prying ears, T-14 crews will communicate with one another and with their command post on a highly secure channel. The vehicle is supposedly entirely Russian-made, but in 2015, cybersecurity intelligence analysts uncovered evidence that the T-14's developers struggled to obtain the night vision equipment they needed within the country. Hackers have revealed Russia's past attempts to buy the parts from a French supplier. Obtaining these parts may have gotten even more difficult as the country faces sanctions for its invasion of Ukraine. An unmanned version of the tank is supposedly in development, but this is slightly hard to believe when Russia has failed to employ even a fraction of the 2,300 manned T-14s that it claimed would enter service between 2015 and 2020. In 2018, the date for getting this done was pushed back to 25, and at one point the entire project was put on hold. But in 2021, Russian officials said that production would begin in 2022. It's unclear where the project currently stands, and the T-14's absence amid Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine is telling. Only a handful of these tanks are known to actually exist. They were first spotted in 2015, shortly before a planned appearance in a parade. While rehearsing for the event, one of the tanks stalled. It started back up and drove under its own power after attempts to tow it failed. It definitely wasn't a good look for a vehicle that's supposed to be the world's most sophisticated tank. But if some of the claims that the Russians are making about the tank are true, then it'll bring Russia a lot closer to competing with American military technology. Until relatively recently, few experts seemed worried about this possibility. But now, some analysts are legitimately concerned that the T-14 could outcompete NATO's main battle tanks. Either way, it's a much different design from past Russia and Soviet-era tanks, which were essentially known for being cheap and expendable. The shift to more advanced and expensive features perhaps symbolizes a shift in the country's military priorities or an increased determination to increase its standing as a world superpower. Even if the tank's technology turns out to be impressive, some are already questioning whether the Russian military will acquire many of the vehicles, and the future of the T-14 Armata remains uncertain. So far, The army is only committed to buying a few of the tanks, and in 2022, the country's state-owned arms manufacturer began marketing the vehicle for export. 1. Merkava and Nama tanks. Development of the Merkava series main battle tanks for the Israel Defense Forces (IDF) began in the 1970s after negotiations to buy chieftain tanks from the United Kingdom fell through. With its engine in the front rather than the back, and its turret set further back than most conventional tanks, the Merkava more closely resembled some infantry fighting vehicles than an actual tank. Its unusual layout enables crew members to quickly enter and exit the vehicle, but makes its engine more accessible to enemy forces. A direct hit to the front of a Merkava tank would probably disable it, but probably wouldn't render it immobile, according to national interest writer Charlie Gao. On the other hand, in the event of needing to evacuate, the ability to make a quick exit through the rear of the vehicle could prove to be advantageous. One of the major issues the Merkava ran into during its early service years was the catastrophic result of an ammunition hit. Most of the tank's ammunition load is stored in the fire-resistant containers in the hull, with the more modern variation storing a limited number of rounds in the turret. In this sense, the Merkava was designed more as a defensive tank. Offensive designs like the American M1 Abrams typically store their ammo in the turret and can be reloaded much faster. Despite any of its disadvantages, the Merkava is considered one of the best designed tanks of all time. Protecting the crew was a top priority for its designers, who equipped the tank with thick, solid armor. It was also armed with a turret-mounted main gun, along with a slightly higher than average ammo supply of 62 rounds, as well as 3 machine guns. The Merkava first saw combat in the 1982 Lebanon War, and it performed well against the Soviet-built T-72 tanks that fought under the Syrian military. As the Israeli military frequently encountered conflict over the following years, it continuously improved upon the Merkava's design. The newest version, the Merkava 4 Barak Lightning, is slated to enter service in 2023. The Merkava's design served as the basis for the development of the world's most heavily armored personnel carrier, known as the Nama. As part of the modification process, the Merkava's turret and main gun were removed and its armor was strengthened. Armor side skirts were added to protect the top of its treads, and its traditional hull was replaced by a V-shaped design for maximum undercarriage protection. The Nama is also equipped with the Israeli Trophy Active Protection System, which uses radar to detect and repel incoming projectiles, as well as machine guns and smoke grenade launchers. It's capable of traversing over challenging terrain, but was also designed for maximum survivability in a crowded urban environment. These seemingly impenetrable vehicles are better armed than the newest and most advanced Merkava tanks. Namas first entered service starting in 2008, but have been implemented in limited numbers due to budget constraints. Despite any financial limitations it may face, the Israeli government has continued to focus on improving its military technology. In addition to the up-and-coming Merkava 4, the Defense Ministry announced in 2021 that the first production phases of a new 8-wheeled armored personnel carrier are underway. Dubbed the Iton, the lightweight vehicle contains a combination of features borrowed from both the Merkava and Nama tanks. It's armed with improved security features and was also designed with mobility in mind, reaching a top speed of 56 miles per hour. The Iton will replace the Israel military's aging M113 armored personnel carriers, which have been in service since the 1960s. Thanks for watching. Which one of these tanks is your favorite? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.